Hi, I'm Shelby Shadwell, and this is For Art's Sake. I'm from Missouri, Springfield, Missouri, and I studied, got my Bachelor of Fine Arts from Washington University in St. Louis, and I studied and got my MFA at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, so I'm very familiar with the Midwest. I lived in the Midwest most of my life, vast majority of my life, before moving out west. I had never been west of Kansas City until I physically moved out to the west, and it's a different planet out there. I mean, I'm used to, from growing up, I'm used to trees, I'm used to humidity, I'm used to not being able to see the mountains and things like that, like you can see in the west with the lack of atmospheric perspective. And I think that in some ways, some of this work may be a throwback to when I was living in the Midwest. I feel like with all the trees and woods and things that you get out here, it's a little more claustrophobic in some ways, and I think that gets you thinking a little more, just a different way of thinking than when you're out in the West and you've got this giant sky and you can see the mountains, you can see everything around you. Not being able to see those kind of spaces in the Midwest is something I think that has deeply influenced my thinking about things, just in that sense of claustrophobia. And again, you think of maybe cockroaches or trash or decay and rot, and you think of maybe the woods and the sort of soil bed of the woods and all these things sort of churning up. I think that's just something that may stick in my mind to this day, even though I'm out west. This is Untitled 12. This is one of the drawings I've done from observation. And what I usually do, just to get into the process of this, is this is on paper, and I have this a sculpture set up in my studio. In this case, it was a sculpture made of black plastic trash bags, and it's to scale in my studio. And what I do is I have a drawing board, large-scale drawing board, and I have my paper tacked to it. And the drawing at the beginning starts with just completely black. It's all charcoal. And this is what we call sort of a reductive method of working. So the whole drawing surface is black with charcoal, and you get kind of a mid-tone gray, some of the middle tones that you would see from the observed sculpture, which is lit with direct lighting. And so then I come in with erasers. I usually kneaded erasers and things like that first, and I have the sculpture off to the side, my drawing, to where I can reach it, and I'll just block everything in a very gestural manner. I'll use the eraser to work back to the lighter tones. So this starts all black. It's not, dark black, but I use the eraser to bring back the lighter values of the observed values of the sculpture. At the same time, then, I'll come back once I have a big gestural sort of study done that's really rough, and I'll come back and then start to refine and refine and refine. So I work reductively, and I get back to the lightest values using a variety of erasers, including knead erasers, pencil style erasers, and I also have a machine eraser that works really well. And then I'll come in and I'll work additively to get the darker values. So I'll use usually a black pastel, which is darker than just a compressed charcoal, to block in all of the darkest values. And what you get is you get a really sort of soft and very dimensional drawing by working additively and reductively in that fashion. So by starting with the middle tones of everything, they kind of bind everything together, and it's much easier to see when you're drawing from observation. It's much easier to see what's lighter than middle tone, and it's also much easier to see what's darker than middle tone. What's hard to see is all the middle tones. So by starting with kind of a darker middle tone, it just makes the drawing process much easier. So that's the sort of physicality of the work itself and how I sort of make it. One thing I do like about this particular piece and this method of drawing that you get is this sort of trompe-l'oeil effect. So you're kind of fooling the eye where, depending on where this drawing hangs, but a lot of times this sort of cut out in the sculpture, in the shadow, looks like you're looking through the drawing to the wall behind it. And I thought that worked particularly well in this drawing and in this piece. This particular piece, I think it's A Universal Picture 4. My work was untitled, as we talked about with the other piece initially, and as I've developed this body of work, I decided to give it a title of A Universal Picture. The A and the U in A Universal is together. It's a reference to horror films and A Universal Studios, Universal Studios, where that are responsible for a lot of the monster movies that we know today in America. But anyway, this is A Universal Picture 4, and like the previous piece I discussed, I have my sculpture, in this case again trash bags, tacked to the wall in a very gestural way. And just to give a little background on that, whenever I create these sculptures, that's actually the fastest part of the process. When I create the sculptures, I'm not thinking about anything in particular. I'm trying to keep my mind really in a meditative state and not think too carefully about how the sculptures sort of take shape. It's what I've found in the work is that a lot of times they have sort of primal or subconscious archetypes that end up influencing the way the sculptures look and therefore the drawing. But I have this up in my studio and I light it. As you can see, I lit this one from below, as you can see reflected in the drawing. And again, the paper starts off charcoaled entirely black, and I work reductively with erasers to bring out the light values, and additively with black pastel and charcoal to build in the darker values. And again, you get this very dimensional looking drawing. At the same time, and I think this fits in with the theme with the entire show, although this is a very representational drawing and it's drawn from observation and it is dimensional and it feels like you're looking through a window, at the same time, the process of drawing is an abstract process. It's a process of abstraction and sort of translating things that you see onto a two-dimensional surface, which can never be like a photograph. I have to make decisions in all of these little areas. You know, how are the elements of design and drawing going to somehow mimic what I'm seeing? And so there's an abstract process that takes place in all of these areas to build in these details. It's a process of abstraction to some extent. So I love the intersection between when something looks like what is observed and it has that illusional quality, but at the same time, when you get up close to this thing, you can see how I've had to make decisions to mimic what I was actually seeing. And so, you know, you'll see, you know, hatchings or weird little shapes that don't really look like what I was drawing, but have this sort of illusionistic quality in the drawing itself. As far as scale is concerned, I always thought working at this kind of scale became very important to me for a number of reasons. And one is sort of, again, in this physical act of drawing, I like the fact that in these drawings I can really, you know, get up here and just work with my entire body and my entire arm rather than just my wrist. Although I do work, you know, very detailed in a lot of these as well. I like the fact that there's a wonderful sort of whole body process when it comes to creating these particular things. This is A Universal Picture 3, a much more recent piece, and as you can see in the subject matter of this, it's not cicadas, but it is cockroaches. It's the American cockroach, actually a number of them, all put together. And when I was talking about previous pieces with the trash bags, I talked very directly about how, you know, although it's an observational drawing and it looks illusionistic, it's also very abstract in its formal qualities. The shapes and the lines and all of the elements come together in service to an image, but there's still a level of abstraction there. And I think when you look at this particular piece, although it's the same in some ways with the trash bag drawings, There's also a sort of what I'll call a macro level of abstraction here to some extent. It's not just the formal elements that are happening in the work, but when you look at this, it's a little more like sort of a Rorschach test, not just on the formal level, but on a macro scale. You look at this and you might see, a galaxy or something like that, or hopefully people will see, various things in this as if it were sort of a Rorschach. I hope all my work works that way, but I think that this piece does that particularly well. This is just usually I'm drawing directly from observation with the trash bag drawings. With this particular piece, these are all cockroaches that I had that were sort of crushed up, they long dead, and I just, again, very gesturally made a little pile of cockroaches in this sort of primal archetype of a ring here. And for this, I'm not drawing directly from observation, but from photographic sources, because what I found was that the scale to translate that was becoming very difficult, and I wanted to be able to get all the little juicy elements of the dead cockroaches in the drawing itself, and so I felt like photographic sources were the main way of doing that. Representation and abstraction. This is a representational image of this pile of cockroaches, but at the same time it's very abstract. I moved from trash bags to cockroaches when I was doing a residency in Wendover, Utah. And I was outside one evening, and what I noticed was we had a lot of cockroaches that would come out during the evening and invade our grill area where we had cooked a lot of meat. And one night I kind of got fed up with it, and I just went a little crazy, and I stepped on a number of these cockroaches. And thinking about these ideas of representation and abstraction, it was kind of a epiphany in some ways, but I noticed that this wonderful little creature, this, in some ways a very perfect kind of a creature, very old, ancient, it became abstract when I stepped on it. It was just this perfect organized thing, but becomes abstract when you step on it. And so there's kind of a larger metaphor here about representation and abstraction, in that these cockroaches themselves have been abstracted by me in a way, and I thought that was really interesting. And again, to tie this into sort of monster movies, I think that it's always really interesting. Some of the best monster movies out there are the ones where the monster itself it hides among us in some way. So you think of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and the aliens look just like us. You don't see them. John Carpenter's The Thing was one where the monster, the alien, looks just like another animal, but then what you find is in these monster movies that all of a sudden abstraction takes place. The monster jumps out of the body or the dog or whatever it is, and it becomes very abstract. And so I'm really thinking about these ideas of what's seen and what's unseen, and in some ways now an idea of imitation. I found myself sort of imitating these things that I was looking at, these sculptures I was making, or trying to imitate them as best I could. And at the same time, in these monster movies, I think the ones that are most compelling are where the monster's trying to imitate other things as well. And I find that to be a compelling idea. I always thought that to be a very strong idea, and we as artists imitate things a lot of times. But at the same time, it's an imitation of what I'm looking at, but it's also a deep level of abstraction here, again, on a couple of different levels. And again, just as the process of this being made, again, this starts as a very, I tone the whole page with compressed charcoal, so it's black, or close to black, not the darkest value, but very close. And then I work with erasers to bring out the light values, and especially on this piece, a mechanical eraser, because that's the way I can get all these little snaps and pops and things in here that really add to the dimensionality of the image itself. And then I work with black pastel to build in the darker values here. And again, scale is very important here, and you'll see something in this particular work. You'll see a number of, and you can see this in all the drawings, but a lot of times you'll see, large gestural sorts of marks that go through this entire drawing. And people have asked me about that, and the reason for having those, or the reason they just sort of came about, is that going back to this idea that yes, this is a drawing, yes, it is representational, but it's a drawing and it's abstract. And that process, and especially again working at this scale, things happen and marks happen and energies happen within the drawing. And I think that these sort of large sort of marks of charcoal and eraser kept this in the realm of drawing and being a drawing and rooted in the process of drawing, and a little less in the process of sort of photorealism. Even though these are very representational, I wanted to keep these works in the realm, firmly in the realm of drawing, and I feel like that's just what happened in the process of creating this. I mean, you get excited and you just sort of, you know, and a mark happens and then another, and I really like how it kind of binds the whole thing together in a very sort of interesting way. I'm very pleased at how that turned out. One other aspect to these drawings that I did want to mention, and sort of to bring it into the context of art and art history, people often ask me, why are you making drawings of things like trash bags or cockroaches or diapers, these very disposable things that are not valued in society? And I wanted to address that. I feel like I'm fitting into a larger art historical dialogue. You know, if you think Robert Rauschenberg and a lot of artists throughout history, bringing the everyday, or what we think of as mundane and not very important, bringing it to the status of sort of high art. You know, you see that throughout art history, and I feel like I'm just in some ways fitting into that sort of dialogue, or I want to have a dialogue with those other artists that have done similar things. So elevating the disposable, elevating things that we wouldn't think of as high art to this maybe the status of high art, I think has been important in art history, and I want to be a part of that, and I want to have a dialogue with other artists that have done that. And hopefully it makes the viewer, think about things in a different way. You know, usually you look at a trash bag, you don't think anything of it. It's just, it is what it is. It's to be thrown away. It's to put trash in. But if you think about it in an aesthetic way, you know, or you look at my work and then that causes you later to think about, you know, something every day in a more aesthetic way, whatever it is, I think that's important. Or a cockroach, something like a cockroach or a diaper. You know, if you can think about these things in a more aesthetic way, I think that brings a little more roundness and richness to life and to the viewer. My background is in printmaking and drawing, both for my undergraduate degree and graduate degree. And I grew up around printmakers and did a lot of printmaking. And in undergraduate and grad school. Since then, I've been doing more just drawing and going back to my roots in a lot of ways as far as just observational drawing is concerned. Printmaking influenced me and still influences me to this day. Printmaking is a very complex process, and it teaches you how to lose a little bit of control with an image, because you don't know exactly what that print is going to look like. Oftentimes it's going to look different than you anticipate, and there's a wonderful aspect of surprise with that. It's a lot of hard work as well. For what that made me realize when I was printmaking is that I needed to sort of make my process more economical and just kind of get back to basics. I mean, I was doing very complex print processes and this and that, and all of a sudden I felt like in some way my process was cluttered. And so in a roundabout way, printmaking was important because it made me realize what I don't necessarily want to do at this moment in time. I love printmaking and I want to work with printmaking again, but it made me realize that I needed to economize my process. And I've done that in these particular drawings and just taking out everything except for the charcoal, the paper, the erasers. And there's something very peaceful about that and meditative about that as I work on these drawings, and just a very clear, identifiable problem that I can deal with. My printmaker friends may get mad at me, but I love you all. I love all my printmaker friends. When it comes to talking about also, again, the subject matter and the content or the connotations these particular materials carry, you know, trash bags, of course, you put trash in there, all kinds of waste, it goes and it sits in a dump. Of course, cockroaches being associated with waste and decay and disease to some extent. Diapers, of course, and all the contents that, you know, are in diapers, and just this sort of uncleanliness and unhealthiness. That's an integral aspect, I think, to the particular, the work. At the same time, I don't think about that as much. I want viewers to engage with that discussion. For me, the reason I chose these materials, yes, they have that sort of thematic thread through them. They're disposable, they're unhealthy in some ways, or they have those connotations. But for me, it's more about kind of the aesthetic way these things look. I love the way that the cockroaches sort of glistened. I love the way that the trash bags glisten in the direct light, and the diapers as well. What I would prefer to happen is that viewers come up and think about for themselves the sort of aspects of waste and decay. Because I don't have that answer yet, necessarily. I don't know why that's important. I think a couple reasons why that might be important for me on maybe a more subconscious level is that, I mean, we live in a very wasteful society to some extent, or you could make that argument. We live in a society that's very consumer driven, and there's a lot of waste, and black plastic trash bags, they're made out of petroleum products, out of oil. And I think that may be something that I have to think about more, is how this idea of waste and decay function thematically in the work. Again, I'm more interested in the formal, but I don't doubt that is a part of the work. But I just haven't really quite figured that part of it out yet.